Peace.
Peace.
This is Joshua Law, Mr. PhD. You're just now entering the cipher called Real2reel360. KYs.
Peace, God.
Bring that beat in, kid.
Indeed.
Peace.
Yeah. What's going on, party people? Welcome to the Real2reel360 show. Let's get it in.
We do the knowledge and wisdom so you can understand. Real360 shows in full command. We changing the game for how it all was taught. From bondage to freedom to an independent thought. Yo, the show is here to bring about a change for real. To lighten everyone so we all know the deal. 360 degrees is a fact. We created the show to give our love back to our communities so we can know what's going on and give them the support from knowledge to born. So if you're ready to learn, then it's time to go. Sit back and relax and enjoy your show. Peace. Peace and blessings to one and all. Peace to Allah's 5% nation of gods and earth, and to all the human families of planet Earth, I bid you greetings. I be the DJ KYs, aka Kato, the Black Superhero. Welcome you to another super and explosive context show for the Real2reel360. So let's just jump right into it. But I can't jump right into it without bringing on my co-host, my brother in God, the one and only Joshua Allah, aka Mr. PhD. Peace, God.
Peace. Peace to Lost 5% and to all our followers and listeners. Today is going to be a very impactful show as we have today the Honorable Representative Christopher Rabb. He will be adding on with us today and speaking about different things for our youth in the community. At this moment in time, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and salute the representative, Mr. Christopher Rabb.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. And it's Rab like rabble-rouser.
Rab, yes, sir. So how you doing today, Representative, sir?
I'm doing well. I had the opportunity to speak to some preteens in North Philly about gun violence prevention and listening to them and their ideas about what we can do and what folks like me in the state legislature can do to address the public health crisis, particularly in the Black community around death by gun. And I was really blown away by these young brothers and sisters who had some really amazing insights. 100% of them had loved ones who are impacted by gun violence, myself included. So it was a powerful conversation, hour-long, nonstop, and I was really inspired by these young folks.
That's something that's definitely on the table. The gun violence with the adolescents, more so now, moving into the 2022, 2023 years, and it seems like they get their hands on guns so easily. How can we prevent, our children from getting their hands on these guns?
Well, there's two things. One is I got two teenage boys. And if you gave them a choice of, you had on the table in front of them a book on a subject they cared about, or the most expensive shiny gun they would have seen on TV or in the movies,
yes,
they'd pick the book, right? They'd pick the book. I don't need to know if the gun was loaded. I don't need to know any of that other stuff. I know that my kids wouldn't choose the gun under any circumstance. They choose the book, right? And you can say, well, that's reasonable. And some of the kids, I think most of the kids who I talked to this morning would pick the book as well. But the fact that there are kids, and we're talking about kids right now. We're not talking about young adults. We're not talking about adults. We're talking about kids. The fact that there are kids who would choose like that, a gun before a book, says more about the context in which they're raised as our children than about that individual child, right? And so this is not an issue for kids who are in a loving, caring environment who don't have to worry about that choice, or we don't have to be worried about what choice they make because we know they're going to make the right choice every single time. So what we're really talking about is those children who have been traumatized their whole young lives such that they would feel picking up that gun made a lot of sense, right? We're not talking about law-abiding adults who have a permit to carry. That's a whole separate issue. We're talking about children.
We're talking about children.
We're talking about children, right? So the fact that there would be a child who would be drawn to a gun over a book is a failing of society and indicative of white supremacy and all the things that seek to destroy black communities, right? Because if a gun is an extension of your identity as a black child, that says more about the pathology of society as it does about that child, because it's our responsibility to raise that child, right? It's a village, right? That it wasn't Hillary Clinton who said that. That was our ancestors who were talking about that, right? And there's truth in that. The collective responsibility of us raising our children in safe and honorable ways, right? So that's number one. Number two is, and let me ask you, brothers, name me one black manufacturer of a gun.
I don't
ghost
know.
guns. I don't know one either. I know a few things. I don't know about that. I asked them, I said, name me any of the storefronts on Broad Street in North Philly where they're manufacturing guns legally. And they couldn't think of any. That's because they're not manufactured in our communities. In fact, most of the guns used in the homicides in black and brown communities in Philly and other places in Pennsylvania are guns manufactured by corporations and sold to gun dealers in the suburbs. In the suburbs, right? All the bad stuff is supposed to be happening in our community, right? Yet and still, the highest subset of guns related to crimes that lead to homicides in black and brown communities are sold by overwhelmingly white-owned gun dealerships in the suburbs. Yet we don't hear about this, do we? No, we don't hear about this. You're not going to hear this on MSNBC, CNN, Fox News. You're not going to hear about it on local news. You're not going to hear about this because the narrative is that it's black on black crime, which is not an accurate representation of what's really happening. The facts show that it's not black people killing black people, it's neighbors killing neighbors. And because of racial segregation born of white supremacy, it's black people killing black people because they live right next to each other, and white people killing white people, which is what's happening in Ukraine. Those are the same people.
Right.
They speak the same language. They've been in the same part of the world for thousands of years, and they're killing each other like dogs in the street. No one's ever calling that white on white crime. No one understands interracial, not intraracial, not interracial, but intraracial violence more than white people. But they never talk about white on white crime. So I'm not going to say this is an issue of black on black crime. I'm going to say this is violence born of white supremacy, where we are using their weapons to kill ourselves in our communities. So if we cut off the stream of guns coming from the suburbs into our communities, it will be harder for those folks who want to do harm to their neighbors to do so, because it's harder for them to get the guns they need. And by the way, these guns coming from the suburbs are acquired in a legal way. These are not illegal guns. And people don't talk about that. But these are legal purchases of guns that are then being sold illegally in the hood.
Mr. Rob, I would like to add to that, because me being a retired military man, I've noticed that within the black communities, the amount of guns that are being sold are really standard weapons. But yet the militias that have their weapons are military type weapons. We're talking about heavy machine gun, artillery weapons and stuff of mass destruction, as they want to say. So when it comes to, if you notice that within all the actions of most crimes that were committed through the white people, they were using heavy machinery weapons versus a normal, say, and I hate to use that word, but a normal black on black crime spree. We're using old standard weapons, semi-automatics that, it's easily to get on the black market. unless you are real connected with them to get those type of arsenal weapons for military, paramilitary type tactics, you're not going to be included.
That is a great point. If you look at the guns that are confiscated, that are found at crime scenes in our communities, they're cheap guns. They are not the AR-15s we hear about all the time in the mass shootings, as though mass shootings account for most of the murders by gun in our country, which they don't. We're used to mass shootings. It was really consistent shootings in our neighborhoods. We don't need to wait for a mass shooter because the shootings are nonstop. So your point is on point. So my suburban Democratic colleagues are concerned about assault weapons because when the kid goes into the suburban school, they're packing an AR-15 that they got from their dad or they got from a gun show or whatever. That's a very different profile than the folks who are shooting up our neighborhoods here and across the country. And that means that we need different approaches to the different kinds of violence that besiege our communities, right? One size fits all will not work. And I also talked to these young people this morning about the different ways that these illegal guns are used. So they talked about how people in their community would have an illegal gun, not to commit a crime, but to protect themselves and their families because they didn't trust law enforcement to do so. Now, that doesn't make it right, but it does explain the behavior, which we can then figure out how to address. Then you got corner boys. You got folks who are slinging on corners and they got to protect their stash. Also, not a good choice, but if they're in that line of work, they need that protection. Now, if you make getting a real job and you pay them more than a poverty wage where they don't have to put their life on the line, they won't need the gun. If we have other ways of, go ahead.
Pardon yourself for cutting you off, Representative Rabb. That was the thing I was going to ask about. Do you feel that the reason why individuals are doing what they're doing because it's the lack of the resources for education and also for job readiness programs, because the lack of trade and things of that nature, which they are making minimum wage, and even though minimum wage has just went up some in different areas, it's still not enough to take care of a family.
Absolutely. Listen, I try to avoid fast foods. I try. I'm pretty good at it. I wasn't raised to eat fast food like at home. I did when I was hanging out with my friends as a teenager, but generally I avoid it. But and I'm able to put food on the table for my sons. But if I'm working 3 jobs and I'm working a poverty wage job, and I got to feed my kids on a limited budget, you damn straight I'm taking them to McDonald's. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but the price of groceries, access to fresh foods, like you can get it at Whole Foods, but that's a whole paycheck, right? I mean, that's not a reasonable assumption for folks to do. So if I'm in a community besieged by violence and I see that law enforcement is as much part of the problem as they are the solution, where I feel like I'm not protected, but I'm endangered by the police I know in my community. I'm just saying as an example, if there are people who feel that way and it's their responsibility to protect their younger siblings, to protect their mom, I respect that. But it puts them in a bad situation because the choices that they are given end up being criminalized. I someone who worked on my campaign, young brother, in the past, he did the same thing because his block, there was a rash of robberies and such, and he was worried as the Christmas season was coming up, all this stuff. He was worried, and he was the protector in his family. He was the eldest sibling, and he made some bad choices. That he needs help. That has more to do with poverty and a lack of good jobs in his community than it does any criminality. He never shot anyone. He didn't have a criminal record before that. In fact, he was in college. He was doing all the things he was supposed to do, but because of the zip code in which he lived, because of the body he inhabited as a black man, The choices he was given were far fewer than everybody else. And how do we figure out how to expand those resources and opportunities and not just put him into criminal justice and put him in the prison industrial complex? It has to be our priority. And here's the last thing. If we were to arrest every single person who owned an illegal firearm, or rather we were able to prosecute every single person who was arrested for an illegal firearm, we would not solve the violence problem, because the majority of people are undiscovered, aren't arrested because they haven't been caught. Mm-hmm. So there's not enough police. If we doubled the police force in Philly, you still couldn't address this issue. We cannot arrest our way out of this problem. We cannot incarcerate ourselves out of this problem. We have to address root causes. And here's the problem I have in the largest full-time state legislature in the country. If my colleagues are too afraid to use the term white supremacy, to use the term systemic racism, to use the term, all these, if they're too afraid to even say the word, then we are no closer to addressing real radical, I mean, this is what it is, radical change, systemic change, than at any other time. And we have to address the root causes. If we're just going after the symptoms, we're going to be talking about curfews and stop and frisk and other things that don't really address the issue. And that's the hard work. It's not easy work, but this is a hardcore problem. And this is why conversations like this are so important. I'm having a more in-depth conversation with you two brothers than I do with people on the Judiciary Committee who are responsible for making new laws for throwing people in cages. We have to have real conversations. And that's why I wanted to come on this show, because y'all are keeping it real. And without us having this type of conversation, we as Black folk can't move forward, because there is some complexity in how we address this. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Again, Mr. Rob, I did some research again, and I'm looking at Forbes magazine came out with a year ago. The United States sold over 20 billion guns. The second highest rate, is according to Forbes magazine. I just looked that up. It's almost to say guns really almost supply and demand of guns. Really, when we go back to the steel era, we understand the Rockefellers, Carnegie Hall, the Brown and Sterling and Smith and Wesson factories. These factories are legally protected under the NRA. So it's basically like saying, it's almost like it's like a rock and a hard place to try to say, how can we stop this if their main source of income is making these things right here in the United States to make purchases, because they say otherwise they got to eat too somehow. So if we was able to control that, that would mean they're going to be out of business. They would be pissed off, and they will find some other means to make munitions with.
Right. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, that goes back to systemic change. If you look at the industrialists that have led to these markets where it's about supply, they need to profit off of the creation of these munitions for their own benefit and for the shareholder, maximizing shareholder value. You're absolutely right. The thing that has changed, though, is when you see this type of violence happening in affluent white communities, that's when the priorities change. They're like, oh, it's acceptable. That's what Black people do to Black people. They kill each other. They have no respect for each other. But you talking about our white babies? You talking about our affluent suburbs where everything is supposed to be perfect? Oh, we're going to have a problem. And those folks vote. They vote. They have money. They cut checks to politicians. And that's when collective power of voters and other constituencies become almost as powerful as the industries. There are industries that used to be huge that now are dying on the vine, like coal. Coal used to be king, but coal is so dirty and so expensive that solar and wind is kicking its butt. And that's the market saying that. This is not environmentalists saying that. That's a fact in the market. That's Wall Street saying wind and solar is radically cheaper than coal will ever be. So coal will have to die because they care more about the market than they do about the individual business. They'll let anything go that's stopped making money. And their allegiance isn't to white people, isn't to an industry or a corporation. Their allegiance is to profit and to greed. And sometimes the confluence of greed and market changes can actually help us, not for the long haul, but for a particular moment. And I think when we talk about guns, that's going to be one of the things that's going to change, because when rich white voters in the suburbs are saying, we got to stop this in our communities. Oh, and if it benefits other people in cities, that's fine too. But this got to stop in the suburbs. You better believe they don't care about any industries. They don't care about any lobbyists. They're going to shut it down. And they have a very powerful voice when it comes to elections, because when it's always like red or blue, Democrat or Republican in any given election, and the election is decided by just a few thousand people, the people who keep changing their minds going between parties are those suburban, often white women. And if they get fed up, that pendulum can start shifting. And in that moment, that's when we have to find alliances. We have to build alliances. It's not going to be across every issue. It's not going to last for decades. But in those moments, we got to be smart. It's that, there's an old expression, politics makes for strange bedfellows, which means that, and it's not a political spectrum like this, like a line. It's more of a horseshoe, where if you're really, really on the left, you don't trust government. If you're really, really, really on the right, you don't trust government. The two are very different, but for different reasons, you don't trust big government because of its complicity in systematic racism or surveillance or privacy issues, which a lot of militia folks, a lot of libertarians don't like big government. So even if you're right for different reasons and you agree on in that moment, you have the ability to make change. And we've seen that before, and we're going to see it again.
I watched going to gun shows because I heard you speak on the gun shows, and I watch. It's predominantly Caucasian. When you go to the gun shows, it's not a lot of the black and brown people that's there, and it's a lot of promotion of white supremacy when you walk in there, because they have different signs and different things that go on in there. And if you watch the fathers with their young children, and I'm talking about 8, 9, 10 years old, they're purchasing them AR-15s, Mini 14s, and things of that nature. And that's not a hunting weapon. That's not something that you're going off in the woods to go shoot a deer with, And we saw what happened in DC on January 6th and things of that nature. How is it sitting in the seat that you're sitting in and having to have these type of discussions about these different militias and things of that nature, and the racism that is affecting the black and brown in the community?
That's a great question. I represent the bluest dot in the state. I represent a majority black district, 65,000 folks in Northwest Philly. So that dynamic of hunting and fishing is not a dynamic I can personally attest to or have residents and neighbors who have that upbringing. But in all rural areas across the country, black or white, hunting, fishing is a part of that rural tradition and cultural thing that also leads to male bonding and to all those things, which is I don't believe is inherently bad. Right. If you believe a gun is an extension of your manhood, that's a problem. That's a problem. It's one thing to say, I grew from a boy to a man through having traditions of learning how to respect nature and how to hunt and how to fish and that sort of thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't. But that's you bonding with other people in your family, in your community, saying, I'm learning these age-old traditions that indigenous people learned, hunting, fishing. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, as long as it's aligned with nature, right? We need to do these things to feed ourselves, to protect ourselves, etc. But when you start saying, no, this is connected to my identity as a boy or a man, regardless of the firearm, regardless of how I use the firearm, whether it's a hunting rifle or an AR-15, which brother DJ K. Wise, you know, that's for military purposes,
Right.
which has a role for military purposes, not for civilian use, right? So if you then start connecting firearms as an extension of your body, of your identity, we have failed, right? And so then you connect it to your whiteness. You have weaponized your social identity as a white person. Now, I know plenty of white people who are not proud of being white, and many of them are like, I'm white, I didn't choose to be white, I know I benefit from being white, but I don't think I'm better than other people as a result of it, and I certainly don't feel that my whiteness makes me better than anyone, it just gives me more opportunities. Those white people have a responsibility to talk to all those other white people who are probably in their family and school them. None of us can do that. I can't roll up to any of these gun shows and say, white brother, I want to talk to you about your proximity to whiteness. And no, I can't do that. That's dead on arrival. I might not even make it out alive. That's not my role. That's white people's job. And I don't expect white people to come into black communities and tell us how to act. That's our responsibility. I'm just saying, right? So in the state capitol, when I have these conversations, they don't want to talk about the insurrection because they can't say anything because the people back home may not have a problem with the insurrection. And if they do, they may not get reelected. So there's a lot of silence and a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to that.
That's my next journey right there to ask you this question, because let's reverse the polarity, because a lot of times they say problems can be solved from the bottom up. But if we reverse the polarity and know that it can be resolved, if we start from the top where we have the chain of people who are making these decisions, making these laws, passing these bills of change, if we change them, their mindset, and or move them out of the office that they're in to make a change, that will trickle down to where we are as far as we're looked at on the chain or the food chain of people. Because if you're a person or like when a raccoon is in a corner and ain't got nothing else, it's the most dangerous person, animal. Similar to that of black men, when we in a corner and we ain't got nowhere else to go, we're going to fight for our lives. We're going to give it all to make a point. So if we have people to learn the education, the system, to learn the government system, political system, the state system, the legislators, because everybody always thinks that, if I vote for a president or don't vote for a president, that makes a difference. It really don't. You got to go in your whole own town and pick your legislative people there really to start making change. That's the bottom up part. But then when the bottom gets up to the top, they need to come back down and remember where they came from. But we have a lot of people that turn a blind eye away from the problem because the problem isn't, the money's not in the solution. The money's in the problem.
I think you're on to something. I think it's a both and situation. And what I mean by that, I'm going to give you an example. Just 2 hours ago, I was at a rally in support of nurses who were overworked, underpaid. They needed help. And the university hospital wasn't giving them the support they needed. So I showed up to lend my voice to them, to their struggle, right? Because they're busting their asses during this pandemic, protecting patients, caring for them, doing all the right things, and they're not getting the protections they need. After I spoke, someone from the nurses union came up to me and said, hey, I need you to support this bill that helps protect against workplace violence. So if somebody comes into a hospital and starts beating up on a nurse, they need protection because that workplace violence has increased significantly, particularly in the pandemic. So I'm against all kinds of workforce violence. And this nursing union was very supportive of me in my efforts to get reelected recently. They were right there on the front lines, supporting me, doing everything they could for me. I've been there for them. They've been there for me. So when they said, we want you to join on this bill, I said, tell me more about this bill. And if this bill includes more criminal offenses, creating more criminal offenses, I don't know if I can support it, because every time you create a new criminal offense, it's more opportunity to lock up more black people without addressing the root problems. And I said, if this puts forth a new criminal offense, I don't know if I can support it. Because we lock up 25% of the world population, even though the U.S. represents only 5% of the world population. So we should be the safest country in the world, but we're the least safe country of all the developing nations, and locking people in cages is not a real solution. So I told this woman who was there for me. I mean, she knocked on doors for me in the rain. She was there. But I had to have the courage to tell her, despite all the support, all the money they gave me as an elected official, as a candidate running for re-election, that I have my limits, and that under no circumstances am I going to feed the prison industrial complex, even though I support protecting nurses and allied professionals from workplace violence. And she was like, oh, okay, let me think about that. But I had to have the courage to do that. I could have said, look, if I say no to her, they're not going to give me any more money. They're not going to support me. I can't be reelected. I can't do this. I had to have the courage of my convictions to say, I can't just say yes because you cut me a big check, or because a dozen of you came out to me knocking on doors to support my reelection. I have to be true to my beliefs. And that's hard when folks like me can get a $50,000 check. In Pennsylvania, someone could cut me $1 million check. Now, if I accepted $1 million from some kind of group and then they had a bill that they wanted me to support, that'd make it really hard for me to say no, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, to your point, we have to make sure that the elected officials, that we understand the position that elected officials are, what kind of pressures they get, and to make sure that our expectations are not unreasonable. And it also means that we need to make sure that we elect people who have integrity, because that wasn't an easy thing for me to tell her. I may not support one of your most popular bills that all the nurses want, because I have my beliefs. And if you're not willing to have that hard conversation, you're not prepared to lead as an elected official. So I think that it goes both ways. And that's something I can work on with other elected officials, saying, you need to step up and speak truth to power. You need to tell even your donors, I have my limits. You need to tell your constituents and your voters, look, I understand where you're coming from, but I disagree because this is what I believe, not because it's what's best for me, but it's the values that I ran on as a candidate. And if I'm just going to do whatever the highest bidder tells me to do, then I'm going to be the one in the headlines saying, oh, Rep. Rabb took money from this shady group and that shady group, and he waffles on issues because of the money. So we have to do both, and we have to start up here and go down, and we have to start here and go up and meet in the middle.
Now, how do we address the racial disparity when it comes down to the gun violence? Because in the last month or so, we saw these mass shootings in Buffalo, Texas, and a few other areas. And then you see shootings in places like Baltimore, South Philly, West Philly, and things like that. And the prosecution is totally different. They always say the Caucasian or the individuals who done the mass shooting, like in Buffalo and Texas, they have mental health issues. Don't they feel that in the Black and brown community that we have mental health issues as well?
No, because we are the face of crime in this country. We don't get that. We don't get those excuses. We don't get those protections. That's for white people. White people say, oh, he had a mental defect. It's not him. It's not his fault. He needs help. And you notice they always safely secure the armed white person after they kill a whole bunch of people, and they kill the Black person who's unarmed.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, I mean, that's a pattern. That's white supremacy built into law and law enforcement. That's built in, because just because the bodies we inhabit, we are considered a threat. In fact, after this podcast, I'm going to be circulating a forthcoming bill that removes the right of law enforcement to shoot someone in the back. Because there's a law in Pennsylvania that says you can shoot someone in the back if they are fleeing arrest. But if they're running in the opposite direction and you're a trained officer of the law, that's not a threat to you. Now, that may be a threat to anybody else who has a gun, but you're a cop. You're supposed to be trained for those situations. If you're running away, you can be shot in the back and it's a justifiable shooting. So what we're talking about here is two different things. We're talking about mass shootings that have to do with racism, where white people say, I'm going to take out a whole bunch of black people because I'm a white supremacist idiot and I have access to guns and in this extension of my white masculinity, and I'm going to knock them out. That's one thing. That's growing. That violence, that racialized violence is growing, and access to assault weapons makes it harder. When we had the assault weapons ban federally, over the 10 years it was in force, those mass shootings were significantly reduced. Once that ban was removed, we're seeing a spike of it like we're seeing now. But then we have an increase of violence within black communities. That has more to do with poverty than anything else. And because a higher percentage of black folk are in poverty and have higher levels of unemployment, and we are dealing with the trauma of a pandemic, it makes people with limited resources and opportunities make really bad decisions. Now, 99% of black folk aren't going around shooting people. It's that 1%, right? It's not like every black person has a gun or an illegal gun or is making bad decisions with those firearms. It's a small percentage of folks who, if we had the right resources, we could reach out to, which is why I was talking to preteens, right? And I'm talking to preteens, talking to them about the things that matter most: the love of family, education, self-worth. All of these things are the biggest protectors from using guns against themselves and others. And that can and should be done by local black-run community groups. And we deserve to have access to government funds, local, state, and federal, to use in ways that make sense.
Okay. Mr. Rob, let me ask you another one since you're going there, and I appreciate everything that you're saying right now. And my concern is this: on the accountability on both sides, okay? And I will use the police force as an example, as we've seen so much in the television, much put by the news. Anytime we have a bully cop, I'll just use that term, a bully cop that hides behind his badge to be a bully, and they apprehend someone, whether it be a black man, brown man, whichever, as they're using excessive force, and the cop that's next to that cop knows that this one is using excessive force to apprehend someone, isn't it his or her duty or responsibility, and not just by law, but integrity wise, to stop that officer from going further than to do more damage, as we've already seen? So why don't we hold the person who's also seeing this, who's in that same line that should have stopped him? Shouldn't we hold their feet to the fire just as much? Do you see that coming around nowadays?
I think that's an excellent point, and I agree 100%. Again, this is a both-and situation. Yes, we should hold the bystanders with badges accountable, because if that's their partner or they're on the scene and they allow for this to happen, they should be culpable. Absolutely. They should also get the support once they've stepped in, because law enforcement has a different set of rules than every single institution we know of. There has never been a golden era of law enforcement. You could say there was a golden era in different fields, but there's never been a golden era in law enforcement. There's no time previous to now where black folk felt safe with law enforcement. Not in the 80s when I was growing up, not in the 50s before the Civil Rights Movement, not during the Civil Rights Movement for sure, not during the Depression, not during the turn of the century. Never. There's never been any accountability or transparency in law enforcement. That's just not how that institution has worked. So there's a pushback of traditional law enforcement officers who are saying, we don't want y'all talking about what we do. This is our job. You have no business to critique what we do, because they've never been critiqued in the way they are now. And that's largely due to Black people and young people speaking up. But they must be held to the same level or a higher level than even folks like me who are elected officials. Let me give you an example. Every single dollar I receive in my campaign has to be accounted for and is accessible almost immediately on the internet. Every dollar I spend as a state representative has to be accounted for. My salary is on the internet. My home address is on the internet. Everything but my social security number, my ATM pin is online. There is great accountability for me as a public servant, and yet I do not have a badge or a gun. So if I have the ability to actually kill someone or to detain someone, the level of accountability and transparency has to be high. But let's say you're a good cop in a foul police department. Let's say you're a Black cop who wanted to work in the community where you were raised and help keep your community safer. But you see racism happening in your unit. And you know that if you speak up, you could be killed, you could be demoted, you could be fired, you could be suspended, you could be put in the basement, you could be written up. What are the protections for those folks on the inside who want to do the right thing, but are penalized for trying?
Right.
We have to provide protections for any whistleblowers, but specifically in law enforcement who want to speak up. That's corrections officers, that's sheriff's deputies, that's whomever. We need to give them the space and the resources for them to be protected for doing the right thing. Because why would someone who has to put food on the table for their loved ones, why would they go out of their way and ruin their career by calling out their partner of all people if there was no protection for them? That doesn't make any sense. So yes, we need to hold them to account, but we also have to give them the resources, which means totally overhauling the thin blue line and this notion that you can never talk about another cop. I hate bad politicians, because bad politicians make it 10 times harder for good elected officials like me to do the work. So if I don't call out the shady folks, regardless of their party, regardless of their race, regardless of what city they represent, if I don't call them out, I'm part of the problem. But I have greater protection than cops. And I'm not here to be an apologist for cops. I'm here to speak the truth. And the truth is, if you don't provide protections for whistleblowers, particularly whistleblowers who are surrounded by folks with guns and badges, nothing's going to change. But we do have the ability to do that. We can set up funds, programs, laws, practices to give them the protections that they need. But just saying do the right thing is not going to be enough. We need to do all of that.
Representative Rabb, do they have any cultural sensitive programs in these police academies now that will help them understand the people that they're supposed to be protecting and serving?
Not enough. And every state is different. Every state is different. What happens in Pennsylvania is different than North Carolina, different from New Jersey, et cetera, et cetera. And what gets you removed, decertified as a law enforcement officer, depends on what state you work in. So whatever they do around diversity or cultural competency, it could be only a few hours. But here's the bigger issue: recruitment. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But if you're trying to build something and your toolkit is just hammers, you're not going to be able to build anything, because you need all the tools. You need to hire people who are problem solvers. If all you're doing is hiring bullies who say, oh, they don't look like me, I got to whoop them, that's a problem. It doesn't matter how much training you give them. You got to make sure that you go after the type of people you want to truly protect and serve. And if you don't hit them on the front end, no amount of training is going to make a difference. And I can tell you that from experience, because I work with politicians and we have an hour-long ethics training every year. Most of my colleagues, and I just do these training with Democrats. So many of my Democratic colleagues think it's a joke. They don't pay attention. They come in late. They make jokes. They don't listen. They don't take notes. They don't agree with the ethics training. So making them go to a mandatory ethics training that they ignore, it looks good on paper, but it doesn't change anything. What we need is good candidates before they get elected who won't need the ethics training because they know right from wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my colleagues don't know right from wrong. They don't have integrity. That integrity is not built on the job. It's built before the job. The same applies to law enforcement. If you don't have critical thinking skills, if you don't have compassion or empathy for people who don't look or act like you, if you don't have mediation, conflict resolution skills, and you don't want to, if you think your culture is the only culture that matters, nothing else matters. It's not going to change. They're going to be one more hammer knocking down black folk, knocking down immigrants, knocking down anybody who they think is different and not worthy of the full protection of the law. So it's about recruiting the right folks. And who decides who are the right people? Well, for generations, it's been law enforcement leadership who says, these are the right people we want for the job. And it's normally white men from a certain demographic saying, we need more folks like that. What we need to have is, well, I don't believe the investment should be in law enforcement. I think it should be in other areas so that we don't need as large a law enforcement community to begin with. Because even though my district is 75% black, the predominantly white neighborhood I represent, very rich. You don't see a whole lot of cops. Why don't you see a whole lot of cops, even though it's the safest neighborhood in the city? Because they have everything they need, and they don't need it from cops. They have access to therapy, right? They have lawyers. They have good schools. They have all the things that everybody in the richest country in world history should have too. Now, I'm not talking about big mansions and luxury cars and yachts. I'm not talking about that. But everyone in the richest country in world history should have a high quality education, should have food, shelter, clothing, should have all those things, should have basic access to healthcare. All the things that rich people have in the neighborhood, in one of the neighborhoods I represent. When you have all those things, you don't really need cops much. We don't need cops on every corner. We need to get rid of the poverty that creates the cycle of criminality that puts people into that system. But we don't want to invest in anti-poverty initiatives because there's so much money people make off of poor people. Poor people spend more money on lower quality products and services than rich people. So that's capitalism. And unless and until we talk about those systems, we just kind of moving around deck furniture on the Titanic.
Josh Amel, what was that? What was that you called it? The training for y'all? What did you call it? Cultivating culture training?
Oh, what we do is we have training for cultural sensitivity, where we have to understand the different races and things like that, even with the LGBTQ and all this other different sensitivity training. But
which is not bad, by the way. I just want to make the point. The training is not bad.
It's not bad. It's the individual. Right. It's the individual that's receiving the training is the issue.
Well, the reason I asked that job because when I was in the military, same thing. We used to call it CO2 training when I was an NCO for equal opportunity, NCOER. What we called it consideration of others, CO2, where we would have these all people from different nationalities, races, and all kinds. We would have to bring them together because the military, just as well as outside, as well as the inside, we dealt with racism almost on a daily basis. So taking those classes was a enrichment, but yet also it's like the gift and the curse because sometimes people just don't want to hear it. People hate to hear the truth because when it hits them hard, they have to face their own inner demons about what responsibility and role I take in that part or my family's generation taking part. So that's why we have to have these consideration of others and respect one another, and the changes we have to make in today's society. And you're exactly right what you was hitting on. That's why I was waiting because you hit it on the head when you talked about the cultivating thing. So that was why I had to add that on. That's piece.
And listen, I do some of those trainings too. If you have a willing audience, right? I have some. I'm 52, but I have colleagues who are in their 80s. I also have colleagues who are much younger, who are fellow elected officials, state legislators, who don't represent diverse groups, and they don't want to offend people. Like, oh, I don't. Am I supposed to call you black? Or can I call, I have a constituent and they said they're African American. Do I have to call all black people African American? Does it make me a racist if I call a black person as a white person? Like, they don't know. They don't know who to talk to. So over time, they have built some comfort talking to me. And I'm not the type of dude who will shut somebody down. I will give them an opportunity to speak, and I'll school them if I have to. And when I do, it's to make them learn. And if not to make them learn, but give them an opportunity to learn. And if they choose to receive that in good faith, then we keep it going. And so I have white folk who come up to me and say, can I talk to you about these issues? Because I don't know. I'm ignorant. Like, I don't represent a lot of black people, and I'm new to this issue. Those folks are great folks to talk to because they're open. They know they don't want to be racist. They may acknowledge that they have some tendencies that are not so good, and they want to improve. They want to grow. Those are great people to work with. But if you talk to somebody who says, I don't even believe in racism, it's black people who are the racists, you're wasting your time. Right. The only way they're going to learn is the hard way, and that's not going to be in a workshop. So training is invaluable, but you have to consider the source. You have to consider the opportunity. So this is not about dogging trainings, but it's we will do better if we go upstream. Upstream is making sure that we pick the right people before they even get into the academy, before they even finish the academy training and become an officer. We got to pick them. But the other thing too is important. There are all these graphs. If you Google like police department hours on the job or something, you'll see these charts that show what percentage of time police spend on violent crime, on returning 911 calls, all that sort of thing. The percentage of time that cops spend on going after the bad guys, the most violent criminals, is like 1%. So then you got to ask yourself, well, what are police officers doing? How are they spending their time on taxpayer dollars? And it's not to say that if they're not going after violent criminals that they're wasting our money. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if the vast majority of the work they're doing has nothing to do with finding and arresting the bad guys, why are cops the one doing it? Particularly if they're not trained to do the majority of the work they do. Let me give an example. If someone calls 911 and said, my son is having a psychotic breakdown, he's lost it, and I'm afraid he's going to hurt himself or his siblings. They call 911 because that's the only thing to do, and it's 3 a.m. Right. The cops show up who don't have enough training to deal with someone who's having a mental breakdown. And the person who meets them at the door is a big black boy. He's 15, weighs 200 pounds, all muscle, and he lunges towards the cop. Not because he hates cops or he hates white people or he's trying to hurt them, but he's hallucinating. That undertrained cop, whether they're black or white, is going to try to subdue them. And if they're not
You lost sound somewhere.
Can you? All right, you with me?
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry. I said if they're not properly trained, they're going to subdue that child, and they're going to kill that child. They're going to maim that child. They're going to arrest that child. Do all those things. And who is to say the cops were the right people to go there in the first place? So much of what cops do is not really related to law and order or their training in the academy. What percentage of that work can be given to people who are social workers, who are mental health experts, who are all these other folks to do that work and leave going after the bad guys to law enforcement? That's a conversation I think is worthy of having. That is a delicate conversation, but it's real.
Now, Representative Rabb, I have a question. since they don't legalize marijuana in majority of the states in this country, and individuals still get drug screened, knowing that it's legal in some aspects in some places, it's still illegal to consume as a police officer. So a lot of the black and brown community do indulge in the marijuana, and it makes it hard for them to even get into the academy because of the consumption of. Is he there? He
We
left.
just lost him. I think he tapped out for a second. He might have, you know how people call in. He might have got a call that blocked him out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I really want, but it was getting close to the end of the show anyway.
Yeah, he's back on. He's back.
He's
I'm gonna
back.
pull him
Okay. Where's Adam? Okay.
He's here.
Okay. I don't know if you heard me, Mr. Representative Rabb, that a lot of the black and brown community indulge in marijuana, whether it's the CBD oil, teas, or whatever the case may be, and that makes it hard for them to get into the police academy, even if they wanted to or not. How do you see that a lot of these are
Excuse me.
racially driven rules and regulations that keep us out of the police academy?
Brother Cato, I can't hear Brother Ja.
Oh.
He's talking like a slow monster. We're having a technical difficulty. Can you repeat what he said if you're able to speak?
If I'm correct at hearing, he was talking about the legal and illegal uses within the marijuana stages for people with most. You can't hear me?
It's not. I can't hear you either. I'm not sure if you can hear me speaking
can hear
normally.
you.
If you can,
I can hear you.
All right. All right. So I see your faces. I see all that in real time, but your voices are coming in like you sound like a whale singing underwater. And I don't know what happened.
Let me
I
try.
apologize. I don't know what to do. Let's see if this works.
All right. Can you hear me better now? No.
No, it didn't work. I tried to reset it. I'm so sorry.
Man.
Well, I tell you what. We're getting close to the end. And
maybe you can tell me what to do in the chat, but I can't hear you. I'm so sorry.
Okay, tell them in the chat that we're getting close to the end, and we would love to bring them back on because we've been on for about an hour.
All right, let's see. Okay, I see I made it 55 minutes or so without technical difficulty. I'm so sorry it's ending this way because I was really vibing on our discussion, but I can't hear either of you brothers. But if you were so inclined, I'd be happy to come back on the show. I'm not sure how to address this technical difficulty, but I just also want to thank you for inviting me. You didn't have to do it. And I really appreciate this conversation, particularly among Black men. So often we're talked about and not talked to. And so that's really valuable to me. So I'd be happy to come back on your show.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hey, Kate, so you know what time it is, bro. Take us up out of here, Lord.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much.
I'm asking you to stand by before we close the show for, when we close the show for Backdoor Talk. We might have to just physically call. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, we thank the representative, Mr. Christopher Rabb of Pennsylvania, for coming on and shedding some great words of wisdom and encouragement about how to make changes within your communities, because the only way we can make change is when we make the change for us. And the only way we can do it, it has to be collective. There's unity in numbers. So the power that we bring is the power that we take. All right. So on behalf of my brother in God, Mr. Josh Shamel Allah, aka Mr. PhD, and myself, DJ K Wise. And before I do go, I do want to give one more. I want to give a moment of silence to one of the most greatest and honorable brothers that we just recently lost, and we're going to end the show. I'm talking about none other than Allah B, if we could. You know what I mean, Jock? Just pause. I know how it is. I know how close you was very much with him. So I feel it's just right to just honor that right now. You know, again, to the nation of gods and earths, to all the human families of the planet Earth, we say peace.